Hello, and behind me is the de Havilland Comet 4, which is an upgraded version of the Comet, which was a British airliner that revolutionised passenger travel. And in this video, I'm going to take you on a detailed tour of it. First, I'm going to walk around and tell you what makes it unique and interesting, and then we're going to climb up into the interior and then finish up in the cockpit. So let's get into it. I'm Paul Stewart, and I make videos about planes and a few rockets. This includes reviews of flights around the world and tours through interesting aircraft in museums. If you're into these types of videos, then please check out my channel and subscribe. And a massive thanks to the British Airliner Collection within the Duxford Air Museum for letting me film this aircraft. I'll include a link to them in the video description below, and more videos from their collection are coming soon. To really appreciate the Comet and the incredible leap forward it was, you have to understand what commercial passenger aircraft were like at the time. Many would be flying around in Douglas DC-3s, while the Lockheed Super Constellation was pure luxury. And while we tend to romanticize these aircraft now, the reality is that they were incredibly slow and uncomfortable. When the Comet arrived, it really would have been one of those big leap forward moments, similar to when the 747 arrived and Concorde. This really was like nothing else. Starting at the front, you'll notice how sleek and round the fuselage is. It's possibly not something you realize until it's pointed out, but most airliners have a distinct line between the nose and the windscreen, so that will affect airflow, but this is just one smooth design similar to the 787 or A350. This is a Comet 4, which first flew in 1958 and was the final of 4 versions, and one major change was the longer fuselage, which grew by 5.6 meters, allowing for more passengers and cargo. Here's a Comet 1, and you'll notice how much shorter the fuselage is forward of the wing. Other upgrades that arrived with the Comet 2, 3 and then the 4 were upgraded engines, strengthened fuselage and thicker skin, larger wings and a higher fuel capacity. An obvious question would be how the longer forward fuselage affected the centre of gravity, but interestingly, the engines were upgraded and approximately 400 kilograms heavier than the originals, therefore they provided greater rearward weight. The engine placement is especially interesting as they were integrated into the wing, as you can see. This has the advantage of reducing drag in contrast with hanging them below the wing, like in the Boeing 707 you see here from another video. It also allowed the whole aircraft to be lower to the ground, making loading passengers and cargo easier at smaller airports that wouldn't need such large stairs. The higher placement also reduced the risk of ingesting material in more regional airports, but there were also disadvantages too. If the engine catches fire, the wing is now on fire as well. And if there's an uncontained engine explosion, again, it's more likely to hit something structurally important within the wing, so they actually had to add heavy armor around the engines. It's also more difficult to reach the engine for maintenance, and the design locks in the size of the engine, as a bigger engine simply wouldn't fit inside. These reasons are why other airliners, including the 707, went with the idea of positioning them under the wings in pods. These are the 2 air inlets for the 2 turbojet engines, and this hole in the middle is the ram air intake for the air conditioning. Making our way along the wing, we come across these interesting devices. These here generate a buffeting just prior to a stall that can be felt by the pilot as an old-fashioned stall warning. This here is a wing fence designed to stop the air moving sideways along the wing, thus losing lift, and was quite common on aircraft of this era. We come to this wing pinion fuel tank, which was introduced with the Comet 3 upgrade to increase the range. Now, finding the capacity has been difficult online, but it seems to be around 500 gallons each, and there's one on the other side. The original Comet had 4 Halford H2 Ghost turbojets producing 5,000 pounds of thrust each, but this model, the Comet 4, had a Royce Avon Mk 524 turbojets producing double the power at 10,500 pounds each. Now, there aren't any lift devices on the wing's leading edge, but on the trailing edge were these flaps. This here is a fuel dump valve, and these here are vent pipes for the fuel tanks. The landing gear was in a traditional tricycle layout with 4 tyres on each main landing gear, although the first prototypes actually came with a larger single tyre that would be better for rougher runways, but required much larger wheel wells and wouldn't spread the weight as well, as the B-36 Peacemaker engineers and airport runway repairmen found out. Looking at the exhaust, you'll see right through the tunnel because the engines have actually been removed. These structures here are baffles designed to reduce the engine noise. A disadvantage of the engine in this position is that the noise is released just a few meters from the passenger's ears. This is compared with engine pods, where the exhaust outlet is located on the underside of the wing, so there's something to partially block the noise. Of interest, the Comet was initially designed to have two hydrogen peroxide powered de Havilland Sprite booster rockets sitting between the two engines. These were for high altitude and hot conditions to help the takeoff, although test shows that the standard Ghost engines were powerful enough so they didn't make it into the production Comets. With the 1A upgrade, mass injection was fitted to the engines, which is where water and a methanol mix was dumped into the engines, thus increasing performance, although it would leave a very noisy black plume of smoke behind it. The Comet wasn't popular with baggage handlers, as the cargo door hold was directly underneath the aircraft. This meant that luggage had to be lifted vertically and then slid along the floor inside the aircraft. Most other aircraft had these doors on the side so you could slide the luggage across or up an escalator-like system. Let's keep moving towards the back before we head inside. This object here was simply to protect against a tail strike if the pilot was feeling too exuberant during rotation. Aircraft like the Constellation and Lancaster, and many others, had multiple smaller tail fins for a number of reasons, including the reality back then that hangars weren't that large. And aircraft with single large tails were mostly tail draggers like the DC-3 and the B-17, where the rear was considerably lower than the front. But now hangars were getting larger, therefore a single taller tail fin design was okay. Now going back to the engine positioning, by installing them within the wing and also close to the fuselage, it reduces the major problem of asymmetric thrust and drag in the case of an engine failure. If you think about it, in a 707 for example, if engine number 1 or 4 stops, there's a very large heavy metal thing on one side of the aircraft providing a lot of drag. Because they wouldn't have to worry about this extreme asymmetry in the Comet, it allowed for a smaller tail fin and rudder, which also means that it can fit in smaller hangars. You may note a dihedral shape of the horizontal stabilizers, which refers to the upward angle as you move out away from the vertical fin. This had the benefit of moving it up above the jet efflux, which was important since the exhausts were higher and essentially level with the wings. Again, to compare it with the 707, that had the engines and exhausts much lower. It also helps increase roll stability, which interestingly was an issue with the 707 and required them to install a ventral fin on the underside of the rear fuselage, as you can see in my 707 tour video. Now let's go and enter this beauty via the single passenger entry door. There were emergency exits and another crew entry door, but this single and larger door was for the passengers only. Just quickly looking at the wing above the engines, you can see a vent here for the thrust reverser on engine number 1, and there was one mirrored on engine number 4 on the other side. These vents here are ventilation scoops for the engine bay to help expel unwanted fluids and gases that might have formed around the engines. Now this actual aircraft has an important place in history. In 1958, this was the first jet-powered airliner to fly non-stop across the Atlantic in 6 hours and 11 minutes from New York to London. It did this just 22 days before a Pan Am 707 did the same, although it was helped by favourable winds and couldn't fly non-stop in the opposite direction and required a fuel stop. The 707, on the other hand, could fly both directions non-stop, and BOAC eventually replaced the Comet 4 with the 707 shortly afterwards. Now I won't labour the point, but the Comet was well known for having a number of tragic, catastrophic airframe failures, which resulted in it being grounded for several years. Because this was the first aircraft to go through so many pressure changes, as it flew a lot higher than all other airliners of the era, the problem of metal fatigue wasn't given enough concern. They discovered that the skin wasn't thick and strong enough to redistribute the load, nor preventing a crack from extending once it formed, so one of the major upgrades was thickening and reinforcing the skin. Of interest, when flying the prototype in 1949, crew commented how the floor would bulge and that there was a banging sound from the nose as the skin flexed. In retrospect, this was the first hint of how flimsy it really was. But it needed to be as light as possible because those Rolls-Royce Avon engines that eventually made their way into the aircraft were delayed, so they had to launch it with the weaker Ghosts. Now these knobs here are quite interesting because they let you know that you've reached the emergency exit if lighting is minimal, so you can just slide your hands across here. Now let's look at these seats, which were in a 2-2 layout with a single aisle in the middle. It's pretty clear that there was a lot of legroom. This longer Comet 4 had seating for between 74 to 81 passengers depending on the airline's preferences, and this was significantly more than the 36 to 44 in the original Comet 1. There was also a special charter seating option that could carry up to 119 passengers as well. In addition to the extra few meters of length, legroom was reduced and the seats were made thinner. Here we have a display with champagne and good food reminding us of what flying used to be like. But really, we tend to romanticize it and make unfair comparisons. Remember that flying used to be very expensive, and there were no cheap economy seats. Every seat was the equivalent of first class, so if you want to compare the food and drink and service to now, you really have to compare it with a modern day first class seat. Here's Singapore Airlines first class for comparison's sake. So really, we're actually in the golden era of flying now with very cheap economy seats and very flash first class seats. Now let's make our way into the cockpit. It had a crew of 4 with a navigator on the left, a pilot and co-pilot straight ahead, and a flight engineer on the right hand side. You can always spot the old nav stations as they'd have large tables for the paper maps. He'd use these in conjunction with basic radar and compass systems to plot the course. There was also a spare seat next to him, but it was usually a single person job. Up above was an astrodome for the sextant, which was a tool used since the 1700s to navigate boats and then eventually aircraft. And down here is the actual sextant itself. Now let's jump over to the captain's seat, which was a very smooth and comfortable leather looking seat rather than the fabric or wool that you see in modern aircraft. This circular device attached to the yoke was to steer the nose wheel and interestingly wasn't mirrored on the other side, so only the captain can steer. And being an airline designed in the 1940s, the dials are all analog, but what's also interesting is that the Comet 1's cockpit was essentially grafted into the Sud Aviation Caravelle, that's my French accent there, with de Havilland's permission of course, to reduce development costs. But by the time the Comet 4 cockpit was modified into the Nimrod maritime patrol aircraft, it barely resembled this at all. And jumping back is the 4th crew member, the flight engineer station. Before automation, simple controls like fuel movements, the air conditioning systems, and electrical systems were all their job. And in a second, we'll be leaving through the service door, which you'll notice is quite a bit smaller and only used for the crew. BOAC retired the Comet in 1965, although it continued with other airlines until 1981. The last Comet flight was in March 1997. This was operated by the British Ministry of Technology and used for aircraft research. But I should mention that the Nimrod, which was a modified maritime patrol aircraft, was used by the RAF and was retired in 2011. A Comet 5 was proposed with plans to widen the fuselage with 5 abreast seating, Rolls-Royce Conway engines in pods underneath the wing, and the wing itself was to have a greater sweep, but that never eventuated. BOAC promoted the Comet as a vibration-free flying. The change from the propeller engines to jets dramatically reduced the amount of moving parts and therefore vibration and noise. The jet engines were also able to operate at much higher altitudes, therefore the Comet could cruise at over 40,000 feet and fly above bad weather. It really was one of the biggest leap forwards in comfort in civil aviation history. This is only one of many guided tour videos I'm doing around fascinating British aircraft, so please check out my channel for more of them. Thanks for watching.